David gazed at the Victorian-style house with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. It was situated on a quiet street in a small town where ancient trees formed a natural tunnel over the road. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of birds and the rustling of leaves. For someone who had spent the last few years in the chaos of a metropolis, that quiet was both comforting and unsettling. He had found the house for a surprisingly low price, an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. After weeks of searching and frustration, this place seemed perfect. It wasn't large, but it had everything he needed: a bedroom, a cozy living room, a kitchen with old furniture, and a small backyard enclosed by a wooden fence, weathered by time. David carried his last boxes inside and took one final look at the deserted street before closing the door. The smell of old wood and dry paint surrounded him as he walked through the narrow hallway, observing the details of the construction. The house had a certain charm, with its ornate moldings and wooden floors that creaked lightly under his feet. As he organized his belongings, David tried to ignore the slight feeling of discomfort growing in his chest. Perhaps it was just the nervousness of being in a new place, alone, after the end of a relationship that had left him emotionally drained. Moving to that town, far from everything and everyone he knew, seemed like the best way to start over. By late afternoon, after organizing the essentials, David collapsed onto the living room sofa, exhausted. He looked around, feeling proud of how everything was starting to take shape. The silence of the house was almost absolute, something he hadn't experienced in years. As the sun began to set, bathing the room in golden tones, David allowed himself to relax. The tranquility of the place was finally beginning to calm him. He turned on a small lamp in the corner of the room and decided it was time to prepare for sleep. The long journey and the hard work of the day had left him tired, and the thought of a good night's sleep seemed irresistible. Climbing the stairs to the bedroom, he passed by an old mirror hanging on the hallway wall. For a moment, he thought he saw something move behind him, but when he turned quickly, there was nothing but the dark depth of the house. David shrugged it off, attributing it to fatigue, and moved on. In the bedroom, he changed clothes, lay down on the bed, and, enveloped by the absolute silence, fell into a deep sleep, unaware that the peace he so sought was about to be interrupted in a way he could never have imagined. That first night, David slept soundly, exhausted by the move and the adjustments to the new house. When he woke up the next morning, he felt refreshed, reinforcing his sense that he had made the right decision in moving there. The following days were spent on minor repairs, decoration, and adjustments as he got used to the tranquility he had so desired. However, it was on the third night that something unusual happened. David was lying in bed, almost on the verge of sleep, when he heard it for the first time. A soft sound, like a faint scratching, coming from somewhere nearby. He opened his eyes and remained silent, trying to identify the source. The sound was so faint that he questioned whether it was real or just his mind playing tricks on him due to the absolute silence of the house. Turning over in bed, David tried to ignore the noise, thinking it might be a small animal, perhaps a rat or a squirrel that had entered the house. He made a mental note to buy traps the next day, and forcing himself to relax, eventually fell asleep again. But the next night, the sound returned, this time a little louder and clearly more persistent. David sat up in bed, turned on the bedside lamp, and remained still, listening intently. The scratching seemed to be coming from the wall just above the headboard. Curious, he got up and approached, pressing his ear to the cold wall. The sound continued, rhythmic, as if something was trying to make its way through the wall. David backed away, now definitely disturbed. Once again he tried to rationalize, reminding himself that the house was old, and that in places like this, small animals were common. However, that same night, the sound changed. It was no longer just a scratching. There was something else, a kind of soft, repetitive tapping, almost as if someone was trying to get his attention. David spent some time listening, trying to understand what was happening. Was it really an animal or something more? After a while, he tried to convince himself that he was being paranoid. Perhaps the house was adjusting to the night air, or maybe the sound was some kind of echo. With these thoughts, he went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The noise lingered in his ears, and the feeling that something was wrong began to grow slowly. In the days that followed, David tried to focus on his routine, but the sounds of the previous nights didn't leave him in peace. Even during the day, he found himself stopping to listen, almost expecting the noise to return. When night fell, he mentally prepared for what was to come, a mix of fear and curiosity keeping him alert. Once again, the following night, the sound returned. But this time, David noticed something different. The sound seemed to form a pattern, like a sequence of taps, pauses, and scratches. He tried to follow the rhythm, but the irregularity made each new sound a shock, increasing his anxiety. That night, sleep barely came. David felt restless, his mind working to make sense of what was happening. It was as if the house was trying to communicate with him, but the message remained out of his reach. The unease grew, but he wasn't yet ready to confront whatever it was that was creating those sounds. He needed more information, something concrete to face. The next morning, when the sunlight finally chased away the darkness, David made a decision. He could no longer ignore what was happening. He needed to investigate, to understand the source of the sounds before paranoia took over his mind. After all, there was a logical explanation for everything. He just needed to find it. What he didn't know, however, was that the search for this explanation would lead him to discover secrets that might have been better left buried. David woke up the next morning determined to discover the origin of the sounds that disturbed him at night. The discomfort, which he had previously tried to minimize, was now a constant worry, eating away at his peace of mind. During the day, he found himself walking around the house, looking for any clues, a crack, a leak, an animal nest, anything that could explain the sounds that kept him awake. After a day with no success, night fell earlier than he expected, bringing with it a new dose of anxiety. As he prepared for bed, David found himself hesitating before turning off the lights, as if he were preparing for a silent battle with the house. Lying in the dark, he waited. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and with each passing minute, David felt his heart beat faster, anticipating the sound he knew would come. And it did, like a clock striking the exact hour. The scratching, the soft taps, and that irregular pattern that began to take shape in his mind. This time, David didn't just lie there, passively listening. He sat up in bed, focusing on each sound, trying to decipher what seemed to be a pattern. The taps and scratches weren't random. There was something methodical, almost intentional, in the way they appeared. It was as if he were hearing someone trying to communicate through a language he couldn't fully understand. Taking a notepad and pen he kept by the bed, David began to jot down what he heard. A sequence of 3 taps, followed by 2 scratches, then a pause. The cycle repeated, but with small variations, as if something or someone was trying to send a message, adjusting each time it failed. David spent hours trying to figure out the pattern, but every time he thought he was close, the sound would change slightly, frustrating his efforts. The mystery deepened, and with it, David's unease. He knew he couldn't continue like this, but he felt he was at a crossroads. Ignore the sounds or dive headfirst into the search for answers, even if it meant losing more than a few nights of sleep. The next morning, with notes scattered across the bed, David decided it was time to seek help. He began researching on the internet about inexplicable sounds in old houses, finding reports ranging from scientific explanations to hair-raising stories about spirits and curses. Although skeptical, he couldn't help but feel a chill reading some of the stories. But still, he preferred to believe there was a logical explanation, perhaps a structural problem in the house that he hadn't yet identified. During the day, David called a professional to inspect the walls. The man, experienced in old constructions, spent hours examining the house, tapping on the walls, looking for signs of leaks or rodents. However, by the end of the inspection, he found nothing unusual. Everything seemed to be in perfect condition. Frustrated and even more uneasy, David prepared for another night of uncertainty. He didn't know what to expect, but one thing was certain. It was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore what was happening. The feeling that something was trying to make contact with him was undeniable, and each passing night, this presence became more tangible, more real. That night, as he lay down, David kept the notepad within reach, ready to continue his attempt to decipher the sounds. However, the sounds began before he even closed his eyes, as if the house knew he was ready, as if it had been waiting for him. The scratching and tapping resumed, and this time David noticed something new. The sounds seemed to be moving, shifting along the wall, as if they were following a path. It was as if something was getting closer, gradually, to where he was. David felt a chill run down his spine, and for a moment he was paralyzed, trying to decide whether to continue or give up. But curiosity and the need to understand what was happening pushed him forward. He decided that the next morning he would do something drastic. If the house was trying to show him something, he would find out what it was, even if it meant facing his greatest fears. What he didn't yet know was that by following that path, he was getting closer and closer to a secret he wasn't prepared to face. The next morning began with a weight on David's shoulders. The previous night had been more disturbing than any other so far. The sounds had not only continued, but seemed to have become more insistent, more aware of his presence. He knew he couldn't postpone what he needed to do any longer. If there was something inside that house trying to communicate, he was determined to find out. David spent the day walking around the house like an investigator, observing every corner, every detail he had previously ignored. Every inch of the walls seemed to hide some secret. He started in the bedroom where the sounds were strongest, running his hands along the walls, looking for any sign of irregularity. That's when he noticed something strange on the baseboard, a small stain that seemed different from the others. Getting closer, he realized the stain was actually a small piece of paper, partially covered by faded paint. He crouched down, carefully pulling the paper, and what he saw made his heart race. It was a message written in thin, irregular letters. "Leave while you can." David stepped back, a wave of panic washing over him. The message, simple but direct, was a warning. But from whom? And why? Was the house trying to warn him? Or was it something more sinister? Something left behind by one of the previous tenants who had faced the same terror he was beginning to feel. Despite the fear, the discovery only increased his determination. There was more to be found, more messages or clues that could explain what was happening. He began to search every corner of the house, looking for other signs. In the kitchen, while moving one of the cabinets, he found another message, this time carved into the wood. "They don't stop." With his heart pounding, David stepped back, feeling the air grow heavier around him. The messages were everywhere, as if someone had desperately tried to warn the next occupant. But about what? Next, he went to the basement, a place he had avoided until then. The door creaked as it opened, and a smell of mold and earth enveloped him as he descended the narrow steps. The basement was dark and cramped, filled with old boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. David rummaged through the place, moving boxes, trying to light up the dark corners with his flashlight. It was there, on one of the stone walls, that he found the third message, written in what looked like charcoal. "You will disappear too." That last message turned David's fear into sheer terror. Who had written those words? And why did all the former tenants seem to have vanished without a trace? It was clear that something was very wrong in that house, something that went beyond inexplicable sounds and scary messages. When David returned upstairs, the daylight was already fading, and the familiar nighttime darkness began to envelop the house. He knew that night would bring new sounds, new attempts at communication, and this time he didn't know if he was ready for whatever would be revealed. However, David's choice was clear: flee and abandon the mystery, or stay and confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. The messages not only terrified him, but also awakened a morbid curiosity, a need to understand what had really happened in that house. As he lay down that night, David tried to gather his courage, but the fear was becoming palpable, almost suffocating. He knew the house was alive in a way he didn't understand, and that somehow it was trying to guide him towards something. He turned off the light and lay in bed, waiting for what he knew would come. But that night, the sounds didn't start immediately. There was a deep silence, so intense that it seemed the house itself was holding its breath. Then, in the middle of the darkness, David heard a single knock, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from within the walls. "The next message will be the last." David froze. What did it mean? The house was warning him that something was about to happen, something definitive and possibly fatal. With his heart racing and his mind spinning in chaotic thoughts, David closed his eyes, hoping sleep would come. But sleep was the least of his worries. Whatever was happening, he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. And the next step, the next discovery, would be crucial. Not just to understand what was happening, but perhaps to save his own life. David woke up with a sense of urgency that made him jump out of bed as soon as the sunlight began to fill the room. The words from the previous night, "The next message will be the last," echoed in his mind like a dark omen. He knew he was close to something, but what exactly was still a mystery. Determined to understand what was happening before it was too late, David decided to explore a part of the house he had avoided until then, the locked room at the end of the hallway on the upper floor. Since moving in, the door to that room had been shut with a heavy iron lock, and he had assumed it was just a storage room, like the basement. Now, however, he felt that whatever was trying to communicate with him was somehow connected to that room. David spent the morning searching the house until he found an old, rusty key hidden in one of the kitchen drawers. When he held the key in his hand, he felt a shiver run down his spine, as if he were on the verge of a discovery that would change everything. Climbing the stairs and stopping in front of the locked door, David hesitated for a moment, listening for any sound from the other side. The hallway was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wood beneath his feet. Taking a deep breath, he inserted the key into the lock, and with a heavy click, the lock gave way. The door opened slowly, revealing a dark, dusty room with the windows covered by thick, faded curtains. The air inside was heavy, filled with the smell of mold and neglect. David turned on the flashlight he had brought with him, sweeping the beam of light across the room. What he saw made his heart race. The room looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, with furniture covered in white sheets and dust accumulated everywhere. In the center of the room was an old wooden bed with a torn mattress, and beside it, a rocking chair that seemed to have been left in the middle of a movement, still tilted backward. But what really caught David's attention was the wall opposite the door. The wall was covered with yellowed papers, taped up and filled with hasty, irregular handwriting. David slowly approached, and as he read the words, a wave of dread washed over him. The notes spoke of fear, despair, and something that lived within the walls, something that couldn't be seen, but was always present, always watching. "Don't look at the mirrors," one of the notes said, in large, trembling letters. Another read, "They're in the walls. They see everything." And the final message, written in red ink that looked as if it had been applied in haste and desperation, said, "Run before they come for you too." David backed away, feeling the room spin around him. The messages made sense now, connecting with the sounds he had been hearing at night. Whoever had lived in that room had succumbed to the same terror that was now consuming him. And worse, the message he had found the previous night, announcing a final message, seemed imminent and inevitable. David began to search the room frantically, desperate for more information. He opened drawers, rummaged through cabinets, but all he found were remnants of a life that had ended abruptly. Until, when moving the rocking chair, something caught his attention, a small hole in the wall behind where the chair had been positioned. With the flashlight trembling in his hand, David knelt down and looked through the hole. What he saw made his heart stop. On the other side, he didn't see another room or an empty space. He saw another eye, staring back at him. David fell backward, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the floor, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Panic seized him, and for a moment he couldn't move, paralyzed by the terrifying sight of whatever was on the other side of that wall. With his heart pounding in his chest, David finally forced himself to get up and run out of the room, slamming the door shut and locking it again. He was shaking, fear turning his thoughts into chaos. Someone or something was inside the walls, watching his every move, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. David knew he couldn't stay there. The final message was near, and he felt that when it came, there would be no turning back. Desperate, he ran to the kitchen, thinking of grabbing the phone and calling for help. But when he looked at the device, he stopped, frozen. The screen was dark, as if the power had been cut. Suddenly, the whole house seemed to fall into an absolute, heavy silence. The next move was in David's hands, but the feeling that he was being watched, that every step he took was being monitored, paralyzed him. He knew the final message was coming, but he didn't know when or from where. And as the silence enveloped him, David realized the house wouldn't let him leave without first revealing its final secret. A secret that could be the key to his survival or the harbinger of his downfall. David was on the verge of collapse. The revelations of the last few hours had left him in a state of complete despair. What he had thought was just an old house with structural issues had turned into a nightmare he could barely comprehend. Something inside that house was alive, watching, waiting. And the final message, which he knew was coming, hung over him like an imminent death sentence. He needed to get out, but something kept him trapped, a mix of fear and fascination that prevented him from simply running away. It was as if the house was manipulating his mind, instilling in him a need to understand before fleeing. And there was one last piece of the puzzle he had yet to confront. The message in the locked room said, "Don't look at the mirrors." The warning was etched into his mind, but like a moth drawn to a flame, David couldn't stay away from the idea that the mirrors held the key to everything that was happening. He remembered a large old mirror hanging on the wall of the main hallway, a mirror he had barely noticed in the first days he was in the house, but that now seemed to call his attention in a way he couldn't explain. There was something about that mirror, something he needed to see, even if it meant confronting his worst fears. With slow, hesitant steps, David walked towards the hallway. The house felt colder than before, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning scream. When he reached the mirror, he stood still for a moment, his reflection staring back at him with eyes that didn't seem to be his own. The mirror was large, with a dark wooden frame carved with intricate details resembling intertwined vines. The surface of the mirror was dusty, and David had to clean a section with his sleeve to better see his reflection. As he did so, he noticed something strange, a slight movement behind him, something that shouldn't have been there. He turned around quickly, but the hallway was empty. Nothing moved, except for his heavy breathing that condensed in the cold air. David turned back to the mirror, and that's when he realized. The reflection in the mirror showed something he couldn't see in the real world. There, in the depth of the reflection, he saw a figure, indistinct, lurking in the shadows. It was like a shadow, a faceless silhouette, but with a terrifying presence that made David's blood run cold. The figure seemed to be watching, motionless, waiting. David felt his body tense, but he couldn't tear himself away from the mirror. There was a strange feeling that he needed to look closer, as if there was something more to be discovered. He leaned closer to the mirror, observing every detail, every shadow, until something changed. The figure in the reflection began to move slowly, and with it, David's fear reached its peak. The shadow extended what seemed to be a hand, pointing to the corner of the mirror, where a small scratch on the surface faintly glowed. He recognized the scratch. It was a mark he had noticed before, but had never given much importance to. Overcome by a mix of curiosity and terror, David touched the mirror where the figure had indicated. When his fingers met the cold surface, he felt a strange vibration, as if the mirror was pulsing under his touch. And then, in an instant, the surface of the mirror began to change. David's reflection disappeared, replaced by a horrifying vision. A dark room, with walls covered in strange symbols and a floor stained with dried blood. In the center of the room was a chair, and in it, a figure tied up and bloodied, with its head slumped forward as if it had given up the fight. Around the chair, other shadows moved, indistinct figures that seemed to be watching, waiting for David to understand what he was seeing. David wanted to look away, wanted to run, but he was trapped, hypnotized by the vision in the mirror. He recognized the figure in the chair. It was one of the previous tenants, one of the people who had lived in that house before him. And the shadows around, they were somehow connected to those taps on the walls, to those scratches he had heard for so many nights. Suddenly, the figure in the chair lifted its head, revealing a face deformed by pain and terror. The eyes were empty, but fixed on David, as if begging for help. And then the figure's mouth moved, forming words that David couldn't hear, but that he knew what they meant. "You're next." With a scream, David stumbled back, falling to the floor as the mirror returned to normal, reflecting only the empty hallway. He was panting, with his heart beating uncontrollably. That vision, the room, the figure tied up, the shadows, everything indicated that something terrible had happened there, something that was about to happen again, to him. The final warning was clear now. The house was not just a place haunted by memories or past events. It was a place that devoured those who dared to stay, turning them into part of its endless cycle of horror. And David knew his time was running out. Struggling to his feet, David felt a new determination grow within him. He couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. If he wanted to survive, he needed to act quickly. But how do you fight something you barely understand? And more importantly, how do you escape a house that seemed to have a life of its own, a house that had already claimed so many victims? David knew the answer was somewhere in that house, and with the little time he had left, he needed to find the key to break that deadly cycle before he himself became part of the walls. David was racing against time. The disturbing visions and sinister messages had pushed him to the brink, and he knew that the next step was crucial. With panic becoming almost unbearable, he decided that he needed to delve deeper into the history of the house, searching for any detail that could explain the terror he was experiencing. The vision in the mirror had revealed a dark room filled with strange symbols. David realized that there was something important in that room, something he needed to understand to escape this nightmare. Recalling the oppressive feeling he had when he touched the mirror, he decided to search other places where the house's mystery might be hiding. He returned to the locked room, deciding to thoroughly scour the environment again for additional clues. The place was so immersed in dust and darkness that it seemed to have been abandoned for decades. David lit a flashlight and began to examine every corner with more attention. That's when he noticed a small detail he had previously ignored. An old safe embedded in the wall, partially hidden by a piece of dusty fabric. The safe was old and covered in rust, but it still seemed to be in good condition. David approached it, his heart racing with the expectation that he might find something revealing inside. He knelt down and tried to open the safe, but the lock was stuck and wouldn't budge. David searched the room for any key or opening mechanism, but found only more junk and accumulated trash. Desperate, he decided to force the lock with an improvised tool, determined to discover what was hidden inside. With considerable effort, David managed to open the safe. Inside, he found a series of aged documents and some faded photographs. He flipped through the papers, uncovering a horrifying story that seemed to echo the terror he was living through. The documents were diaries and letters written by former tenants of the house, detailing a series of macabre events. One of the letters, written in shaky handwriting, spoke of a malevolent presence in the house that manifested through enigmatic messages and inexplicable noises. The letter described how the previous tenants had tried to leave the house, but something always prevented them, causing them to remain until they disappeared. David read about a series of disturbing events, mysterious disappearances, nocturnal apparitions, and a constant feeling of being watched. The last pages of the diary were especially terrifying, describing a night when the previous tenant had seen a shadowy figure moving through the house, always watching, always waiting. There was also a photo in the safe, showing a shadowy figure with a blurred face, covered by a hood. David realized that this figure could be the same one he had seen in the mirror's reflection. With a growing sense of despair, he realized that the house seemed to have a pattern. It consumed those who lived there, keeping their souls trapped and perpetuating the cycle of horror. Determined that he needed to do something before it was too late, David began searching for a way to break the cycle. He recalled the messages and symbols he had seen and decided to look for more clues that could indicate a way to neutralize the malevolent presence. As he rummaged through the room, David found an old book hidden behind a bookshelf. The book was covered in dust, and when he opened it, he found a series of rituals and instructions written in a language he barely recognized, but which seemed related to the occult and ancient practices. One of the rituals described in the book promised the expulsion of evil spirits and the cleansing of haunted places. David wasn't sure if he completely believed in the ritual's effectiveness, but the description aligned with his urgent need to resolve the situation. The ritual required certain items and the recitation of specific words in a quiet and controlled environment. David decided he would attempt the ritual, hoping it could disrupt the cycle of terror and finally free the house from the presence that tormented it. He prepared for the task, gathering the necessary items and organizing a space in the main room of the house. As night fell, David began the ritual with a heavy heart and a mind full of fears. He lit candles around the room, arranged the items according to the instructions, and began reciting the ritual's words. The atmosphere was tense and charged with a sense of anticipation, as if the house itself was reacting to what he was doing. During the ritual, David felt an invisible presence moving around him, a growing pressure that seemed to try to break his concentration. But he persisted, reciting the words and following each step carefully. The feeling of oppression increased, and he could hear a low murmur, as if someone was trying to speak to him. When the ritual concluded, a wave of relief and exhaustion washed over David. He waited, anxious to see if the ritual had taken effect. The silence in the house felt different, less oppressive, as if the malevolent presence had been driven away, even if only temporarily. David allowed himself to relax for a moment, believing that there might be a chance to escape the cursed house. But he knew that the battle was not yet won. The house had proven to be more cunning and persistent than he expected, and he needed to be prepared for whatever came next. With a sense of weariness, but also of hope, David decided that he would continue to investigate and prepare for anything the house might throw his way. He was determined to uncover the truth and find a way to finally free himself from the nightmare that his life had become. After attempting the ritual, David felt a brief sense of relief, but the terror he faced in the house still loomed over him. The feeling that something was approaching, the unsettling quiet, indicated that the battle was not entirely won. Determined to better understand what he was facing, David decided to explore the areas of the house he had not yet thoroughly investigated. With the first light of morning, he began to search the basement, a part of the house he had avoided until now. The basement was in a state of complete abandonment, with old boxes and broken furniture piled in disarray. The dust was thick and the air was damp and heavy, giving the impression that time had stopped there. David began to examine each box and piece of furniture, hoping to find something that could provide an additional clue about what was happening. As he rummaged through a pile of papers and old books, he found an object that caught his attention, a small, ornate wooden box that seemed out of place among the dull things in the basement. The box was locked, but David found a small key hidden between the pages of a dusty book. With trembling hands, he inserted the key into the lock and opened the box. Inside, he found a collection of curious objects, ancient amulets, small glass vials with colored liquids, and a series of diaries and notes. David leafed through the diaries, finding records of rituals and occult practices, but also something that seemed more relevant to his situation. A series of drawings and diagrams that described a complex symbol David had seen earlier on the house's walls. The symbol appeared to be the focal point of a series of rituals described in the diaries. The notes explained that the symbol was used to keep something trapped, a malevolent entity that could manipulate and influence those who lived in the house. David realized that without fully understanding this symbol and the rituals, he was fighting an invisible and cunning enemy. As David studied the drawings and notes, he found a reference to a binding key, an object that, when used correctly, could unlock the true nature of the entity and break its hold over the house. The description of the binding key matched an old amulet David had seen before in one of the boxes. He had overlooked the amulet in the rush of his preparations, but now it seemed crucial. With renewed determination, David returned to the box where the amulet was stored. It was a small necklace with a pendant of stone that glowed faintly in the light. He examined the amulet more closely and found an inscription in an ancient language, similar to the one found in the diaries. Following the diary's instructions, David began to search for a place in the house where the symbol could be drawn or placed. He remembered a small storage room on the lower floor, filled with covered furniture and boxes of various materials. This room seemed a likely spot for the type of ritual described. With the amulet in hand, David began to draw the symbol on the storage room walls, using the paint he found in the boxes. The process was meticulous and required precision, but David was determined to follow each step as described. When the symbol was complete, he placed the amulet in the center and began to recite the ritual words described in the diaries. The atmosphere around him began to change. The air was charged with a palpable energy, and the temperature in the room seemed to fluctuate between hot and cold. David felt a growing pressure, as if the space itself was reacting to what he was doing. The shadows on the walls twisted, and he heard low whispers that seemed to come from all directions. At the height of the ritual, the amulet began to glow intensely, and David felt as if something was being released or transformed. The glow intensified until suddenly there was a cracking sound, as if an invisible chain had been broken. The environment became suddenly calm, and the pressure David felt disappeared. He was exhausted, but also relieved. Whatever had been trapped in the house seemed to have lost some of its power. David hoped that the ritual had taken effect and that he might finally find some peace. However, he knew that the situation was not completely resolved. The entity might still be lurking, trying to regain control. David decided to spend the rest of the day reviewing every corner of the house, ensuring that nothing was left unchecked. He revisited the locked room, the basement, and the hallway, looking for any sign that the entity was trying to manifest again. The silence in the house seemed deeper, as if the space was breathing more freely. As night fell, David prepared for another period of vigilance. He knew that if the house was still under the entity's influence, it would be during the night that it would try to regain control. Armed with a new understanding and the tools he now possessed, David prepared to face whatever came next, determined to solve the mystery and finally find the freedom he so desperately sought. As night fell over the house, David was on the brink of his limit. Physical and mental exhaustion was piling up, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down. The ritual performed the day before had had some effect, but the feeling that something was about to happen wouldn't leave him. The house, though seemingly calmer, still held secrets that he needed to uncover. David decided it was time to confront the house head-on. He returned to the mirror in the hallway, the one that had shown the dark room in reflection. This time, he was prepared. He grabbed a screwdriver and, with effort, began to pry the mirror off the wall. As he removed it, he found something unexpected. A secret door, small and old, hidden behind the mirror. With his heart racing, David opened the door and found a narrow staircase leading down to an underground area he didn't know existed. The descent was slow, and each step creaked under the weight of his steps. The air grew denser and colder as he descended, and a growing sense of oppression pressed down on his shoulders. At the bottom of the stairs, David found an underground room. The space was small and dimly lit, with walls covered in inscriptions and symbols he recognized from the diaries and the ritual. In the center of the room was a stone table, and on it, an old book and an unlit candelabra. The room seemed to have been abandoned long ago, but the atmosphere still carried an aura of unease. David lit the candelabra and opened the book. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but still legible. The book contained detailed accounts of a group of people who, decades ago, had used the house as a place for occult practices. They believed the place had a special connection to the spirit world and that they could communicate with entities from another plane. As he read, David discovered that the former residents had summoned a powerful entity, but things had spiraled out of control. They lost control over the entity, and it began to influence the house in unforeseen ways. The rituals they performed to contain it were not entirely effective, and the entity remained trapped between this world and the other, affecting those who dared to live there. David continued reading, absorbing every detail. He discovered that the former residents had created the symbol he had found in the diaries as a desperate attempt to keep the entity under control. But instead of sealing it completely, the symbol kept it in a state of vigilance, always lurking, waiting for an opportunity to fully manifest. At the end of the book, David found a passage describing a final ritual, one that could sever the connection between the entity and the house once and for all. But the ritual was risky. If done incorrectly, it could fully unleash the entity, bringing unimaginable evil into the world. The final words of the book warned against the danger, but also suggested that if the ritual was performed correctly, the entity would be banished forever. David knew he was facing a critical choice. He could attempt the ritual and risk releasing the entity, or he could walk away and leave the house forever, knowing that whoever came after might face an even worse fate. The dilemma left him hesitant, but he remembered the terrifying experiences he had faced and the danger the house posed to anyone who lived there. Determined that he couldn't allow the entity to continue haunting the house, David began gathering the items needed for the final ritual. He brought the amulet he had found, as well as the ingredients mentioned in the book. The underground room was the place where the ritual had to be performed, the epicenter of the connection between the entity and the house. David drew the symbol on the floor with precision, this time adding the additional elements described in the book. He placed the amulet in the center and, with a firm voice, began reciting the ritual's words. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a dangerous energy, and the shadows on the walls began to move unsettlingly. As the ritual progressed, the feeling of oppression intensified, and David felt the entity's presence growing. It was as if something was trying to break free, tearing through the barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds. The candles flickered, and the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness that thickened around him. David continued, resisting the fear that seeped into his mind. He knew he couldn't stop, that he needed to finish the ritual to prevent the worst. With one final effort, he spoke the final words, directing all his energy towards the amulet. For a moment, absolute silence took over the room. Then, an explosion of light and sound filled the space, and David was thrown back by the force of the released energy. When he regained consciousness, everything was silent again. The room was dark, the candles had gone out, and the amulet was no longer glowing. David lay there for a while, trying to process what had happened. When he finally managed to stand up, he felt that something had changed. The oppression in the house had disappeared, and the air felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. He climbed the stairs back to the house, still cautious, but with a sense of relief. As he emerged from the basement, David realized that the house was silent, but not the same unsettling silence as before. It was a peaceful silence, as if the house had finally been freed from the entity that haunted it. Though exhausted and shaken, he knew he had done the right thing. The entity was banished, and the house, at least for now, was safe. But David knew he couldn't stay. The house had revealed too many secrets, and he had risked everything to confront it. Now it was time to leave and put that place behind him forever. He packed his bags, leaving behind any memories of that nightmare, and walked out of the house, feeling finally free. What David didn't notice, however, was the small detail that went unnoticed. A faint shadow that moved on the basement wall as he climbed the stairs, as if the entity, though weakened, had not been completely destroyed. David left the house behind, physical and mental exhaustion marking every step he took towards his car. The sense of freedom he had hoped to feel upon leaving that place was overshadowed by a persistent unease. Something inside him whispered that the story wasn't over. Upon returning to his apartment, David tried to resume a normal life. He reorganized his routine, returned to work, and avoided thinking about the horrors he faced in that house as much as possible. However, even in the safety of his home, the nights continued to be disturbed by nightmares, flashes of moments he preferred to forget. Weeks passed, and David began to notice small things out of place in his apartment. Initially, he attributed everything to stress, but over time, it became clear that something was wrong. Objects moved from one day to the next, inexplicable sounds echoed through the walls, and the feeling of being watched never left him. One night, while trying to sleep, David was awakened by a familiar sound, a faint scratching coming from inside the walls. The same sound that had tormented him in the house. His heart raced, and a wave of panic washed over him. He quickly got up, turned on all the lights, and began inspecting every corner of the apartment, searching for the source of the noise. Nothing was visibly out of place, but the sound persisted, like a reminder of what he had tried to leave behind. Desperate, David began to doubt his own sanity. Had the entity followed him, or was it just his mind playing tricks, a result of the trauma he suffered? Doubt infiltrated his thoughts, undermining his confidence and his hope that everything was over. One night, after days without sleep, he decided he could no longer ignore what was happening. He returned to the diaries and notes he had brought from the house. Perhaps he had missed something important, some detail that could explain what he was facing now. As he reviewed the writings, one phrase caught his attention. The entity is persistent. Even when weakened, its essence clings to those who dare challenge it. The cycle can only be broken with the total destruction of its source. David realized the fatal mistake he had made. By performing the ritual, he had only weakened the entity, but hadn't completely destroyed it. And now, it was trying to reconstitute itself, clinging to him like a parasite. Determined that he needed to finish what he had started, David decided to return to the house. It was the only way to confront the entity one last time, and this time, destroy it once and for all. When he arrived at the house, it looked different, quieter, emptier, as if it was waiting for his arrival. David entered, feeling the same familiar oppression that had greeted him the first time. But now he was prepared, determined to end this nightmare. He descended into the basement, where the ritual had been performed previously. The room was as he had left it, except for one detail. The amulet, which he thought was dim and lifeless, was now emitting a faint, pulsating glow, as if it was waiting. David knew what he had to do. He picked up the amulet, and using the instructions from the diaries, began preparing a new ritual. This time, one that involved destroying the amulet, and with it, any remaining connection between the entity and the world of the living. He lit the candles, drew the symbol one last time, and placed the amulet in the center. With a firm and determined voice, he began to recite the ritual's words, the same ones he had used before, but with an addition, a final destruction spell mentioned only at the end of the book. As the words left his mouth, the amulet's glow intensified, and the room was filled with a strong wind, as if the house itself was resisting what he was trying to do. But David didn't waver. He continued, feeling the entity's presence growing, struggling to break free. At the moment he spoke the final word, the amulet exploded in a blinding light, followed by a shattering sound that echoed throughout the house. The ground shook, and the walls seemed to fold in on themselves. The entity let out a final scream, a sound of pure agony and despair, before disappearing completely. Then silence fell. An absolute silence, different from any other David had ever experienced in that house. The oppression was gone, replaced by a strange, almost peaceful calm. David collapsed to his knees, exhausted but relieved. He knew that finally the entity had been destroyed. The house was free, and so was he. However, the cost had been high, not just for him, but for anyone who had crossed paths with that entity. As the first light of dawn broke, David left the house for the last time. He looked back only once, seeing the dark and silent structure, now just a remnant of what it had been. He knew he would never return there. As he drove away, the sun began to rise on the horizon, and David finally felt the weight of darkness lift from his shoulders. He had survived, but he knew that the scars from this encounter would stay with him forever. And so the cycle was finally broken, with the house returning to its peaceful state, but with the memory of the entity still etched into its walls, a silent reminder of the terror that had resided there. For David, the nightmare was over, but the memory of what he faced would never completely leave him, haunting him in the shadows of memory.